for him trade unionism meant more than what it seems to imply today. And one of his great significance was linking up trade union work with something which we'll look at in a minute. Now, this was in 1935. If you can imagine a society where the strongest power in the world, equivalent probably to the USA today, controlling a whole colonial and so-called empire, how do you struggle against an institution like that? But anyway, this is what Makhan Singh and others tried to do, and his method was through the trade union movement, working with the working class people. I think what is easily forgotten is the issue around class. Colonialism worked through classes. It created a new class to be its torchbearers, who are still around us today. But Makhan Singh was on the other side, working with the workers. And he was elected the secretary of the Indian Trade Union. I think, again, it's important to recognize that strikes and working class struggles did not start with Makhan Singh. I think in his book he talks about the very first strike in 1898 or something like that, the Railway Workers Union. Workers were on strike. So strike and worker organizations have been there throughout the colonial period. But Makhan Singh directed in a particular way, he laid the foundation of a radical movement. But he was active right from 35 onwards. Now you can imagine, even today, to go on strike, the teachers or whoever find it difficult to survive without wages. And in those days, to think that the workers went on strike for 62 days, how did they survive? And how did they have the strength to go on for such a long time? And I think the answer is partly that they build up links in the communities. The workers, the peasants were all supporting it. And it is that solidarity that made it possible for the strike to continue for so long. And that strike, I'm trying to write a play based on the events of that time, so one day I'll finish it. But they won the demands. Part of it was 15 to 25% increase in salary. And if I'm not mistaken, I think they were also fighting for an 8-day week, which we now take for granted. The resistance of people, and that is what the word resistance is important. That is what they were fighting for, and that's what they got. Again, it's only a fact may not be well known that in the course of his reception, a continued resistance, even in the prisons. He wasn't just sitting quietly and praying to God, let me out of. He was resisting, and he gives examples of he went on 3 hunger strikes, one for 10 days, 12 days, and 21 days, 52, 59, and 61. And that's,
Yeah, I'm trying to recall this.
And this is just, we mentioned the working class, the strike in 1937, but this is what it looked like in those days. I don't know that name Jardine or something, I've seen it somewhere, or at least I used to see it. But all this 25% increase, at that particular time, there's some disapproval from the leaflet. This scary sort of keeping an eye on them. And this, if you look at them, they sort of think our workers are candies, I don't know what they are. And look sort of very weak and powerless kind of a thing, wearing dhotis or whatever they're wearing. And yet there was power in that. And I think these kind of images need to be sort of recaptured.
By the way, that's the year I was born in.
37. Oh well. So the strike
I
started.
didn't see any of them.
That's why one of the people, the father was organizing this.
Probably.
Busy doing other more important things, yeah? But really, if you think about it, behind the scenes, the manipulation has increased to such an extent that the news distortion of history, misinformation, disappearing not only of individuals but progressive ideas, actions and people. That is the role of the game, the role of the day. Anything progressive is hidden, and what we get, and I think a very interesting example in Britain is the BBC. I pay my taxes there, which runs the BBC. And all it can do is talk about the royal baby or something for days and days and days. All it can do, and this was something I read recently somewhere, that it gave a fact, so-called fact, that Mugabe has killed 10,000 people during, I think, the last elections or something. So that misinterpretation, the whole wars being waged in Iraq with weapons of mass destruction, where are they? So we are being told what to think, how to think, and if you challenge that, then you are a troublemaker, you end up in Guantanamo prison or something. So Makhan Singh, if you talk about Makhan Singh, you're talking about working class, you're talking about strikes, you're talking about struggles, linking up with politics. Oh no, that can't be allowed. So forget about his history. And that rule, that the way it is done, it's not just them sitting in London and New York and Paris. It's in Nairobi also. That suppression takes place. Who decides on syllabus in universities and schools? Who decides what to be taught to our children? It's not. They make it advisor from all over the world, but ultimately it's a political decision made by so-called leaders in Kenya, committed to overthrowing colonial rule by mass action, strikes, demonstrations, and armed struggle. And I think without that input, Myanmar would have been completely different. And now this was again a worker, a Kenyan worker called Jaswant Singh Baraj. This is an article written by Nazmi, my brother, who is dead now. He wrote a series of articles in a journal called Alak Malak in Gujarati, because in those days it was not easy to publish things in English. So he used this Alak Malak to publish I think he must have written 15-20 articles on different printers, publishers and so on. And this one is a chap, talked about a chap who helped set up the Mao's gun factory and then trained Mao's in technology. So that is the contribution of the working class to the Mau movement. And that is my article on Mau, which is in a sense a revision of that green little book. Now, again, I think we are sort of meant to, there are so many blinkers placed around us that we tend to forget what's happening around us. But here, there's a very, very interesting parallel between what happened in South Africa and what's happening, or what happened in Kenya after independence. And this guy, Ronnie Castells, was active in various ways in South Africa, and he's recently been thinking back. And he says back then, in the 90s, when South Africa became so-called independence, our hopes were high for our country. We had a modern industrial economy, strategic mineral resources, a working class, very well organized, an organized trade union movement with a rich tradition of struggle. So it's our world now, and what happens? But that optimism overlooked the tenacity of the international capitalist system. From 91 to 96, the battle for the ANC's soul was eventually lost to corporate power. We are entrapped by the neoliberal economy. We sold our people down the river. He's talking about South Africa, but I can say it applies word to word to Kenya. And it's a very sad reflection, but I think we need to come to grips with the reality today. Not only South Africa, but Kenya, and to see that this corporate power, the neoliberal economy, is enveloping the whole of Africa. It's not just Kenya or South Africa. And if we are going to struggle against that huge monster, we have to be united in a way. But Makhan Singh's example, I think, has given us some indication of where we go from here. He was collecting, I don't know, fantastic amount. He was an institution in himself, I think. It's difficult to see one person collecting this range of things, like notes taken from a material in the Ministry of Labor, notes on general reading, copies of paper presented to the Historical Association, press cutting. I mean, you name it and it's all there. And I would challenge any historian in Kenya or any working historian or working class in Africa to write a book without going through that research. Do we know how many strikes took place in Kenya last year or this year? They come and go and sort of forgotten. But one, I think, a brilliant example of this recording was again done by Kenya. It affects progressive activists, thinkers and trade unionists such as Pinto, Kagia and Kubai. These are not mere accidents of history, but active attacks on the forces that support working people. So this is all deliberate. It's not something that, oh, they forgot or time has passed. It's an active effort to make the history go away. So imperialism does not only attack people, leaders, organizations and progressive ideas. They attack all those. But it also attacks people's history to erase from social memory their very existence so that their example is not followed today. And I think the very, very nice, easy way to resist imperialism is for us to record our own histories. Talk to our parents, talk to people we know who have been active, record things that are happening today. It doesn't take a sort of £1 million or millions of hours of free time to do it. If each of us can do it in a small way, come together and bring it out. It is therefore the first responsibility of those struggling. This is me saying, incidentally, you can argue against it, for rights of people to research, understand, practice and popularize working class ideas, leaders and organizations, ideology and actions. And I think I want to sort of emphasize the word practice, sort of do it, not just talk about it. And I want to just end with this. I won't read it, but I think for all of us, this is perhaps the most important message we can get today.
I've already told you that I was born in 1937. Well, my father was probably leading a strike, and maybe my mother was giving birth to me, probably. And I was born here in Nairobi. I was only 2 or 3 years old when my father went to India in 1939, and naturally we followed him. So I did all my primary education in India, which is now Pakistan. I was in Lahore, Gujranwala and Garchar for all those years. And my father came back in 1947, August the 15th, he spent actually on board the ship. And my mother, myself, our sister, and my younger brother, we joined him 6 months later. I did all my schooling here from 1948 to 54, I was in schooling here. And my father was arrested in 1950. So I actually really saw him only 2 years, but a very, very active life between 48 and 50, when he was made a great contribution before he was detained in Lokitong, as you know. Now after that, I didn't see much of him because I finished my studies in Kenya in 1954, did my A level. Then I went to India for my studies for 3 years. And when I came back in 1959, my father, by the time my father was released in 1961, I had already joined KPLC. And after KPLC, that's when I joined in 61, so I've done over 50 years in the power sector. So I spent 26 years in KPLC, I left them in 87. But since then I have been very active in the power sector. Only till 2 years ago I was the chairman of the Energy Regulatory Commission, which controls your prices for electricity and so on. So I've spent entire life within my father, but what I want to talk to you briefly is what certain incidents I noticed when I was growing up. And I think you mentioned that he was an Indian fighter. In 39, 40, 41, when my father was also arrested, as you know, he was also arrested in India. He was there for 4 years. He was being transferred from Lahore to another place called, he was being taken by train. And I was, I think, about 2.5 or 3 year old. So my mother, I stayed with my maternal parents, maternal grandfather. And so since my father was going to be moved from one place to another one, the family decided that we go and meet him at the station. And this is the incident I remember. I think I was only 2.5 or 3 year old. And you know, he was not handcuffed or chained, but he was moving in a train. He stopped there for about 10 minutes or something. And I saw him behind. They looked like bars at that time, but actually it was a small bogie, and my father was there. So naturally, I think I saw him for the first time in my living memory of a 3 year old, and naturally I started crying very profusely. And Askari is sitting inside. This is the word I still remember. He says, "Kaka, tu kyo rona hai? Tera pyo te kadi darda nahi kisi ko, tu ka te ron hai?" What he said was, "Young man or young boy, your father is never afraid of anything. What are you afraid of and crying?" This was said to me at that time. So he had that fighting spirit even at that time. Now the other thing, attributes, which I just, he was totally devoted to his work of trade union movement or politics or something. Because my mother once narrated an incident that, look, he said, Makhan Singh, I think he never, in our families and in the Asian family, we don't use husband's name. So he said, whatever she said, look, children are growing, your father is getting old. Why don't you do something to earn a living and to bring up the children? And his words were very clear. He says, I'm sorry, I'm devoted to my work. I can't give up this work that I'm doing, even if you all perish in thin air. But we haven't perished in thin air. This is what we learned. I think this is what has carried us through, that instilled a spirit of independence and self-reliance, which we all suffer today. I have studied, reached my master's, I've reached the top of my profession without begging. We don't have this spirit of begging. Here we always talking, let's go for a begging ball, let's go for harambe, let's go and do this thing. We didn't have that spirit. And that's what I still keep on saying. Unless you haven't learned this business of self-reliance, no matter of growth can come in a country. Because once you're self-reliant, you don't carry yourself with a begging ball. And I think we learned in the childhood. And this independence, that self-reliance we've done, I think my own children are also doing the same thing. They are also grown up. He's an architect. My other son is an accountant. My sister did her PhD after this thing. So all these things, because we learned that thing, that you must live on yourself.
If you want to write our history, if you want to improve this country, we should not beg, go out for handout. And that's very important. But in this country, it's a reverse of these things. That every time we run out to beg from the same people who fought us, who killed us, we go back to them and beg. We become beggars all through the whole thing. And I thought that if we can learn something today, a lesson today, is your speech, and I like it. The second thing is actually the Shiraz's information was very powerful from beginning to the end, and connecting the struggle of the working class to the Mau movement. And the question he asked is this: why in this country that people like Makhan Singh, people like Kagia, people like Kubai are not known? You go to any high school, ask who was Makhan Singh, nobody can tell. Who was Kagia? Nobody can tell. There are two things here, like Shiraz said. One, the imperials distort our history, and they did very well. So you read the books, there's no name of Makhan Singh anywhere in primary schools. There's no names of Kagia in primary school. And if you want to find a name of somebody else, you find Kimathi. One small paragraph that he was a terrorist, arrested by the British and hanged. That's all it is. Okay, these are the Kenya kids. These are the ones we are teaching. What are they going to say? Then comes the exams, the primary exam. What they ask, who was Kimathi? They wrote the same, he was terrorist and he was hung by the British, period. So I think we have to have some type of courage. If we cannot, that the people who write books, we are very few. We are the people who actually, every time we try to insist, people like Makhan Singh should be known, and we should have a monument for him in our national capital. People like Pinto, we should know him in schools, in university, in anywhere, and their only contribution. We should too have a monument in Nairobi for him. The same applied to Kagia, to Kubai, and others who are contributed. And it's a bitterness when you walk around in Nairobi town, the streets. You don't find our heroes. You don't see them. There's nothing we see except the people who actually supported by the imperialism. Is the question I've been asking very much. Why should they have, and I want to put this straight, I don't care what people say. Why should we have a monument for Tom Mboya instead of Makhan Singh? I've been questioning that. But read the history of Tom Mboya. Read it well. Which side was Tom Mboya was during the Mau Mau movement?
I'm very happy and proud to realize that the same kind of resonance is coming from Makhan Singh's son, that this spirit of independence, the spirit of self-reliance, is what will really head us to the next level. Because as I talk today, I recall that I am a son of a very humble family, a peasant family, down in the villages of Nyeri, where my father never got help from anybody to raise me. I mean, he was a Juakali foodie, and he never got assistance from anybody to raise me. He has got nothing in terms of land, and yet I was raised. I went through to high school, got my college education, and I was still thinking in my law class. I didn't hear an example or a court precedent of the works of Makhan Singh, but I could hear rulings of Justice Parker. Justice Parker, the same person who sentenced Makhan Singh to restriction and all that. But we are not taught about such important landmark rulings, identifying Makhan Singh as somebody representing the workers' struggle. That was never taught to us, and yet people like Parker's very prominent advocates hang their portraits in their offices as if they did very great work for this nation. It's a pity. It's a great pity And I came out and qualified as somebody learned in law, and also a certified public secretary through struggles of my parents without relying on anybody. So I really appreciate what you are challenging us, and the challenge is taken, and that's how a country should grow. The other unfortunate thing that is happening today is that this an event like this one, people don't think that we can organize it and it succeeds without getting assistance from somewhere. That is a thinking that should be swept, and go under the bridge, because it's not a perfect thing. We can organize such an event without being helped by anybody. We are not paid by any donor quotas. We have organized it, and I appreciate the fact that you have acknowledged that with our own resources from the pockets, with our own resources. So that is the spirit that we can do.
How can we go forward and bridge this gap between the have-nots, the workers, and the so-called leaders? We heard politics and workers' movement or activists should not be separate. The gap should be bridged. But I have a great bone to pick with that idea in today's world, and that is because the political leaders who were supposedly representing the populace have now turned into MPs. They have taken over the legacy of the imperialists. They consider themselves our masters, and we their slaves. They take every penny, suck every penny out of the workers' funds. Now, when did that happen? It was all about democracy, votes, elections, representation. Where did democracy go wrong?
The reason why we are having this problem, we are having the issue of ethnicity. The entire country is divided, and we are divided through ethnic mobilization. And this country cannot move forward. Because it's very difficult also to be self-reliant if you are divided in a country. Look the history of Makhan Singh. Makhan Singh didn't see himself within the boundary of the Kenya. He mobilized the East Africa. And that's very, very powerful history that has been forgotten, because the patriot like Makhan Singh, their struggle has not been shared. It's a narrative that has not been brought to our generation, so that we don't see outside the boundary. We don't see the struggle of Makhan Singh, not as person within our boundary, but somebody who see the entire East Africa. The challenges now we are facing, and it's huge challenges, and Granish is asking about this question. What's happened that now we are in this problem? What's happened in this problem? This country, if we don't continue revisiting the pillars of the national struggle like Makhan Singh, we may end up with the history of Rwanda. Because today, if you speak from my nationality, they'll tell you Uhuru Kenyatta is the best person who would have had to be the president of this country. And now people, even they are revisiting their history, and they are saying Uhuru Kenyatta is nationalist, is bringing politics of nationalism. If you talk to another ethnic community like Luo, they tell no, Uhuru Kenyatta is a betrayer, and they give you the narrative of the history of the killing of Tomboya, killing of Ouko, removing of Billard Kagia, of Jaramogi in power, and that narrative, there is a narrative of being a victim. They are demanding political justice. Now, our politics are organized now ethnically. That's why we have allied settlement between Kalenjin and Kikuyu, and that's the way it is called Jubilee. And even now, there is no emergence of the new people who are trying to say this narrative is a narrative that can take the country to self-destruction. And that's why we are saying, if Mau Research Center cannot, and other people cannot come in and bridge the gap, because since 1990 we have lost this genuine interaction, because there is no meeting that can be organized in this country without asking for donor money to organize a meeting so that you can do. But and when you do that, you cannot have a genuine reflection, because you do a reflection speaking about where you have. I come from the background of civil society, and we have been with Davinda for a long time, with the National Convention, example NCC, and another movement. But today those movements are no longer there. Why? The constitutional movement is no longer there. I don't know why William Tunga is not in this meeting.
He is one of them.
I don't know why Raila Odinga is not here.
And perhaps an outcome from today's meeting could be a proposal to set up a Makhan Singh Memorial Library. If the idea is there, we can work at the details and all the rest of it. Those of us who have books can donate as a starting point. But I think it's the idea that is important. And once we have that idea goes into the community. People will start asking, who is this Makhan Singh? Is he the book publisher or what? And I think that's one way of spreading the message of his. So I would very much see that as part of this today's meeting, we come up with a resolution or commitment to set up a Makhan Singh Memorial Library. That's great.
My personal experience was very young. I was 7 when he passed away. So my recollection of personally being with him was perhaps between the age of 3 and about 6 or thereabouts, playing like a grandfather does with grandchildren. Every time we'd actually go somewhere like the temple, he was the person who used to sit next to us, and we'd ask for simple things like ice creams and stuff like that. So my personal experience is very, very small. Everything that I've learned is from my parents, my grandmother especially. She told us a lot, and from the books that you've already mentioned and the little bit that we have read. But over the last few years, I was fortunate to, and I shared it with Shiraz just a few minutes ago, to come across his archives. And like you mentioned, we managed to digitize 20,000 pages of his personal thoughts, ideas, moments of history. That's something that needs to be put together in a concise, methodical, logical sequence, where we would need help with a mind who can articulate chronologically ideas, chapters, thoughts, and that's something that we would be very happy to share.
To add to what others have said, I think the greatest legacy is, and I'm afraid Walimu Maina stole my thunder, the greatest legacy is that we have young people like you who are still fighting in the way that he wanted to fight. And this is, there's so many struggles taking place everywhere. We don't know about them. And not everybody is conscious when he's struggling what he's really struggling about, because they see their own oppression, they see their own deprivation. So there are, vast numbers of people who are struggling, but they're either divided by ethnicity or they're divided by, other sort of misinformation.
Come to corruption. We think not unless we steal, we cannot do anything, we cannot move forward. Come to education that we have gone to school to, and all the time, and I value education, because I wouldn't even be communicating to you if I didn't go to school. But sometimes, even if it's aimed for something good, it takes us back. It teaches us history that is not our history, and it instills a lot of fear, a lot of what I would say inferiority complex, such that even when we move forward, we are still afraid.
So we've been looking at what is happening now. The church came in and also started to try to help Kenyans to fight for second liberation. The church has become part of the problem. The church nowadays cannot represent the people. Then the civil society has been forecast by the powers that be nowadays, the one who have taken over power. They have been trying to disorganize the civil society. So if you look at actually the trade union movement that we have in this country, it does not have any agenda for this country. And without an agenda that is pro-people, we are going to lose everything. Because they have taken the church. The politics of this country has been taken by the people who we have been fighting all along. And they do not represent the common person. So it is time now, we need to come up together and formulate a procedure that we are going actually to get sponsor people to take over leadership into the trade union movement so that we can honor Makhan Singh and his group. And it can be done.
We face the powers called imperialism. We face the reality here now that the ruling class is founded on capitalism. And that's why we see most people who rise, rise to the offices, the high offices, are very wealthy and all that. These are realities that we face. We face an administration that if you erect Makhan Singh's monument, they will be cowed. I mean, it will intimidate them in a way that they look at it as arousing the spirits of fighters and workers in the struggle. So that is a reality that we face, and we must now know the tactics to use. We really receive the ideas. They are very beautiful ideas, but to put them to work is what we need to really focus on, and what is the biggest task. So I think working together we will be able to achieve everything. And remember, it's a struggle. Don't forget it's a struggle. That's very important. So thank you very much. The occasion is officially closed, and I think we have taken time very well. We've managed time, and thank you very much for coming.